In the late 19th century, we see some really very significant changes begin to occur in the arts. And really one of the major catalysts for this, I believe is probably photography, has a significant impact on this, as well as several other key developments, political things that we'll be talking about as well. But, up until this period in time, if you wanted an image of someone captured, you paid a portrait painter to do that. But with the advent of photography, it's really kind of a game changer for the artist. And during this late period in the 19th century, the last quarter of the 19th century or so, we see some really dramatic shifts in terms of what artists do. And really, I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that with the changes in society, the changes in culture, and also changes in technology, namely the photograph, artists kind of need to find a different niche. They need to find a different means of creation and of expression. And we see this take place in an explosion of a variety of different artistic ideas and concepts that diverge away from what was really kind of the central acceptable style of the day. And we'll be looking at examples of that as we talk about French academic work, the salon, and a variety of artistic movements that dramatically move away from the salon. So a little bit of kind of general context first about this period in time, about the late 19th century. We have a powerful, long-ruling monarch in England. Queen Victoria rules from 1837 to 1901. 1859, Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species. And of course, this is a significant volume of work that even today has some lasting impacts. Unfortunately, tied with this, the philosopher Herbert Spencer uses Darwinian arguments in order to argue for really kind of social Darwinism, and applies this theory to social and economic structures, and really thereby justifies imperialism and racism. 1870, 1871, we have the Franco-Prussian War. We also have the Paris Commune, the foundation of the German Republic, the unification of Italy. A lot of very diverse and complex things are happening at this period in history. We have the development of the movie camera. We have the Paris Universal Exposition in 1889. Of course, this is where we see the creation of the Eiffel Tower. 1893, we have the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which is also a tremendous event. And then 1903, we have the first flight of the Wright brothers. So we have a kind of a continuation of the Industrial Revolution taking place, whereas in the earlier part of the 19th century, it's really based primarily on things like steam, iron, textiles. During the latter part, we see an emphasis on some other materials, steel, electricity, chemicals. These all become central and important parts of industry as things begin to continue, I should say, to develop and evolve in terms of science and industry. One of the manifestations to this philosophically is a concept called positivism. Positivism is this belief that science is the mind's highest achievement. And this manifests itself, by the way, really artistically speaking, in an art movement that we'll be looking at here shortly called Realism. So in order for us to really have an understanding, I think, of how divergent the art movements of the latter 19th century are, I think we need a baseline. We need a foundation to really look at and compare. And if we're going to do that, we can look here at really who we might consider to be the pinnacle of academic painting. The Royal French Academy really kind of set the rules for what was acceptable art, and France, Paris specifically, really is the center of the art world when we're talking about the later 19th century. And, there were certain things that were acceptable and certain things that really weren't. If you were going to do a large-scale painting, for example, the emphasis, the expectation is that it is a historical painting or a mythological painting or a biblical painting. Genre scenes are okay, but they should be probably smaller in scale and they're less important. Mythology, of course, is important, and we can see examples of kind of what was the style when we look at this artist here. This is Bouguereau, Adolph William Bouguereau, who is one of the most refined, one of the most talented, really, of all the academic painters that we look at from this period in history. He's really well known for doing these images of these kind of playful mythological scenes where we see characters with just absolutely perfect flesh. You know, it's sumptuous, it's accurate, it's rendered with beauty and accuracy of drawing. But it's done really in a very academic manner. It's done very conceptually. In terms of, you can see that Bouguereau has an incredible knowledge and understanding of human anatomy. And his emphasis here really comes largely from what he knows and understands about the classical tradition rather than from optical observation. So Bouguereau, his take on this is kind of interesting. Bouguereau, he actually kind of a little later speaks about this. He says, I accept and respect all schools of painting which have as their basis the sincere study of nature, the search for the true and the beautiful. As for the mystics, the impressionists, the pointillists, etc., I don't see the way they see. That is my only reason for not liking them. Artists like Bouguereau were absolutely the most popular, absolutely the most successful of their day. But it's ironic that today when we look back, he's not considered among the major important characters in the play of art history compared to some of his contemporaries that we'll be talking about here shortly. One of the movements that we're going to be focusing on here as we begin looking at this period in time is it's a movement known as Realism. And the name here can be a little misleading. When we hear the word realism, most of us just really tend to think of and associate this concept with a style of art that tries to capture things in a realistic way. And we kind of need to differentiate between realism with a capital R and realism with a lowercase r. So capital R, realism, proper noun, we're talking about a movement in art that really takes place from about 1845 to about 1880, primarily in France, although we do see examples of this in the United States and other places in Western Europe. When we talk about the main characters involved with this movement, with realism, we're talking primarily about a man by the name of Gustave Courbet. Now, there are other artists as well who are associated with this, Caillebotte, Daumier, Degas, Eakins, Homer, Manet, and Millet. But in particular, Courbet is really he's really kind of the founder of this movement. And Manet is also essential as we talk about and discuss what this is really all about. So let's kind of explain exactly what realism really is. It's not just about rendering things in a realistic way. It's not just an accurate depiction of nature, but it also has to do with the subject matter, particularly interest in down-to-earth, everyday, common subject. Courbet, in fact, actually said about this, he said, I couldn't paint an angel because I've never seen one, which of course makes sense, and you can kind of see how this contrasts strongly with the beliefs that were put forth by people like Bouguereau. Another famous writer, Baudelaire, actually pled for an art that would take on the heroism of modern life as its subject, which realism certainly attempts to do. And we also see that the style of art tends to be a product of an increasingly wealthy and powerful middle class. As I mentioned previously, Gustave Courbet is really the main guy we talk about when we look at the realist movement. And it's important to understand kind of why Courbet and the other people that we associate now with realism objected against the Academy and the style of painting that was popularized. There were really two primary things that they didn't agree with. One was subject matter. They didn't believe that it made sense to paint things that were otherworldly or mythological. They wanted to try to capture things that represented the real world around them, things that they could see and perceive. And the other thing, aside from subject matter, that they didn't agree with was the means of representation. The Academy was steeped in this tradition of, painting things conceptually, understanding through drawing, structure and form. Whereas the realists were much more interested in capturing what they saw optically and attempting to render the effects of light and the way that the eye actually perceived an image. One of the differences that this results in is instead of the highly refined, smooth finishes of the academics, the realists end up with paintings where the surface itself, the paint, becomes an active part of what's actually happening here. You have much flatter surfaces of color, for example, in some places. And this asserts the painting as an actual object. Rather than simply a window into the world, the painting becomes an object in and of itself. And that's a really important distinction to understand when we look at the realists. So Courbet actually attempted to display his work at the Salon and was pretty much categorically rejected. He was turned down by the jurors, and as a result, in 1855, he set up his own pavilion. He set up a series of about 40 of his own paintings, and set up outside and kind of did his own thing. And this is really what we consider to be kind of the birth of this realist style. The work that we're looking at here is one of Courbet's best-known images. It's called The Stonebreakers, painted in 1849. Sadly, the artwork lived for less than 100 years. It was destroyed during World War II. But it's a really powerful image. And Courbet actually saw these two men, a very young man, a boy really, and an old man, working by the side of the road. And they are stonebreakers. That's their job description. They were breaking rocks with hammers. And these rocks were being used for road material. And Courbet saw this and really was just kind of moved by, you know, here we are with all of these new industrial technologies and all the things that are supposed to make our life better, and yet we can't spare people from the most, horrible and really meaningless type of toil that we see these two engaged in. And there's maybe even a slightly larger narrative here, because you'll notice that the faces are kind of obscured on both of these individuals, and that may be intended to infer that this young man on the left-hand side will eventually become the old man on the right. He has no future, and that's really a very powerful statement. You'll notice the way this is painted, it's very different from what we'd see if we looked at, for example, again, Bouguereau or the other academics. We have these flattened areas of color, and again, this is because it's painted optically rather than conceptually. And this image was, of course, shunned by contemporary critics. Courbet had actually hired these two men and brought them into the studio to paint them in order to capture this. And it's a very powerful image in many ways, both because of its political, social statements, and also because of how divergent its technique is from academic painting of the day. So this is another example by Courbet, and one that was just as controversial, if not more so, really, than his Stonebreakers. This painting, titled A Burial at Ornans from 1849, might not look shocking to us today, but we have to work a little bit here in order to put this into context and understand exactly why this painting might have been so revolutionary. So the image really here, as you can tell, it's of a funeral. And it was inspired by the funeral of his mother's father, his maternal grandfather, whose name was Jean-Antoine Odette, who was a veteran of the 1793 Revolution. But it's probably not really intended to be exactly his grandfather's funeral, because the grandfather's actually depicted at the far left side in profile. But what's really remarkable here about this work is that he has created this image on a very, very large scale of a common everyday burial. And why this is shocking is because it was acceptable practice at the time to do a large-scale painting if it was of an appropriately important subject. This kind of goes back to Poussin, grand manner painting style, where you're going to choose things that are based upon, classical antiquity or mythology or biblical scenes. But, he's working on that kind of scale. He's doing a painting at that kind of size. But he's chosen the burial of just an everyday, average guy from the countryside. And what's more, the people represented here represent a social class, a political class, really, a growing republicanism in the countryside, which kind of threatened some of the culture and power of the upper class in the cities. And so the work was really quite rebellious in a lot of ways, both in terms of its subject matter and the way it's represented, but also in the way that he painted it. We have this incredibly thick application of paint. He would use a palette knife rather than the smooth and polished surfaces we would expect to see in academic painting. And the image itself is very powerful in a lot of ways, both because of the context and also the style in which it was represented. Courbet actually later in his life became quite a bit more conservative, and actually was no friend really to the later Impressionists, and in particular wasn't all that fond of the work of Edouard Manet, who we'll be looking at shortly. but his contributions are really quite central to this transition, the shift away from academic French painting. So we'll look here at a couple of examples of graphic arts. This image here is by Honoré Daumier. It's called the Rue Trasnonian from 1834, and it's a lithograph. Now, we haven't really talked about lithographs, so I'll kind of explain a little bit about what that means. We've kind of explored and discussed a variety of printmaking techniques, different intaglio techniques, such as etching and dry point and engraving. We've also talked about woodblock, some other positive relief techniques. Litho is, well, it comes from litho, meaning stone, and graph, meaning to write. And lithograph is an interesting process. It's based on the whole concept that oil and water don't mix. And essentially what the artist does is creates an image using a wax or oil-based crayon on a stone surface, and then applies ink and then water and washes it off. And what happens is that the drawing area, the crayon, essentially picks up the ink. And then by printing this, rolling the paper across this in a press, that image is transferred directly over. One of the real positives, one of the advantages to litho, is that it creates a surface that looks very much like a real drawing, as opposed to the sharp and harsh lines you sometimes get with other plate-based printmaking techniques. Daumier was quite an outspoken individual. Spent time in prison because of his ridicule of King Louis Philippe, but very well known for these dramatic and powerful graphic works as well as his paintings. But the image that we see here was really intended to kind of illuminate this horrific episode that occurred. Really kind of a terrible story. In the city of Lyon, there was a sniper, some unknown guy had shot and killed a civic guard. And the guards determined, they figured out that they believed the shot had come from this housing block, from the structure. And so their solution was to storm the block and kill everyone inside. Women, children, men, everyone. And so here we see this image of this dead man. And you can, if you look carefully, you can see a dead child underneath him. There's other dead individuals around. And so it's this image, this captured, moment from this absolutely horrible massacre. Daumier is also known for doing, in addition to kind of, fairly heavy political works like we see there, for doing some more lighthearted caricatures as well. And the image that we see here is actually of someone we've talked about already, a man by the name of Nadar, you may recall. And this is a lithograph representing Nadar flying up in his balloon over the city of Paris, and it's called Nadar Raising Photography to the Height of Art. And actually Nadar ends up being really pretty important. He's one of the guys who provides the space eventually for the Impressionists to have their own show. But the image that we have here is kind of this, tongue-in-cheek kind of comical image. And if we look down below, we can see the whole city, and every building down there has the word photography emblazoned on a sign. So the next guy we're going to look at here is an artist with a really pretty interesting history. This is a man by the name of Eadweard Manet, not to be confused with Monet, who we'll talk about later. But Manet is a painter who we associate with the Realist movement. And interestingly, his goal was he really wanted to become kind of the successor to the old masters of the Renaissance. In his paintings, he often referenced the classics. And he did this in an attempt to kind of draw a line, to draw a parallel between the Renaissance and his own work. However, because of his subject matter, because of his means of representation, critics of the time did not read it as an homage, but rather as a satire. And so he really didn't receive much popular recognition during his lifetime. But today we look back at Manet and realize that he is one of the most significant, one of the most important artists in history in terms of how much he contributed in the period of time that he was around. He, again, he really wanted he wanted the respect, he wanted the recognition from the establishment, but never really reached it. His works were often really quite controversial, and his career was not incredibly long. He actually died fairly young, at 51 anyway, from syphilis. But his technique was really pretty striking. One of the things the major things that really differentiated him from other painters is that the typical traditional classical and academic way to work up a painting was to begin by drawing out your subject matter and creating an underpainting, a dark underpainting, and then working from that, from dark to light, and ending with highlights. But what Manet would do that was very different is he would begin on the white surface of the canvas and gradually build in the shadowed areas. And the result of this was a much flatter image, but with much greater luminosity. And he abandoned the traditional techniques, processes of using, the deep shadows of chiaroscuro, etc., but instead would put his paint on in very flat and very large areas using a palette knife or other techniques. And he attempted to kind of capture these fleeting moments, this imagery that, again, was optically represented rather than attempting to capture what he, conceptually understood. The image that we have here is known as the Luncheon on the Grass, or Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And the composition here looks fairly traditional. You've got, a series of individuals in a park. And we might look at this and just fail to understand, to see why this would be a difficult or controversial image. We could point at this and say, well, we've seen examples of things like this in history from artists that are well respected. But we have to really kind of take a moment and understand exactly what it was about this painting that was so unique and so unusual. If we look at this next image here, we can see something that may bear a striking resemblance. Here on the right-hand side, we can see the Pastoral Concert by Giorgione. And we'll note that there are some tremendous similarities. We have the clothed men, the naked women, etc., and an Arcadian or park-like background. But the truth is, these paintings, while they might initially appear similar to us, are incredibly far apart. Now, the painting on the right would probably be seen as a masterpiece and accepted by the academic conservatives, but Manet's piece, not so much. And this comes down to a couple specific things. One, the image on the right, these women are not real women. They're not really there. They're muses. They are inspiration. They're personifications. Whereas in the image on the left-hand side, these women are not muses. In fact, the one who's is engaging us with this very direct and uncomfortable gaze is a woman by the name of Victorine Meurent, who was actually a fairly well-known prostitute and one of Manet's favorite subjects. And the two men here are also well-known. One is his brother, and the other is a fairly well-known sculptor. So the combination of these, this completely naked woman, the clothed men, in what appears to be a contemporary French park, turn this from, rather than being an allegorical or, somewhat fanciful personification, to being this challenging image of these people whose behavior is completely unexplainable. And so that was incredibly challenging. That was something that the academic conservatives simply couldn't accept, and they found this to be really quite offensive. And then the other thing, of course, is the handling of the paint. We have these flat areas of color. We do not have the sense of modeling and shadows and glazes that we would expect to see in academic painting. And both of these things, the content, the way it's handled, and the technique used, are greatly divergent from what would have been acceptable at the time. It's really clear when we look at Manet that his relationship to classical art, really to the Renaissance, was quite deliberate. The image that we're looking at here is an engraving by Raimondi, and it's basically based on a no longer existent Raphael. But if you look carefully at the image on the lower right corner, you'll see a group reclining. And here we're going to go to another slide and take a look at the similarities between these two. And it's clear that this is not coincidental. Manet clearly is referring both to this Raphael via the Raimondi and also to Giorgione in both the pose and the content of this work. So the next work that we're going to look at by Manet certainly also has its classical references. This is his take on Venus, if you will. And in a moment we'll kind of do a little closer comparison and look at this compared to the Titian. But this painting is known as Olympia, and once again, this is a work that was incredibly controversial and not particularly popular at the time. While the Déjeuner was never actually hung in the Salon, this particular work, Olympia, actually did make it in, but then was taken down almost immediately due to the controversy. So once again, we have an image here that seems to be kind of on par with what we might expect, the reclining female nude. And that was something that certainly was seen in the French Academy and in the Salon. However, this particular image is not of a woman who's looking at us with submissiveness, not a woman who looks at us, as a beautiful allegorical Venus, but in fact is once again a recognizable and known prostitute. Manet's favorite model, once again, Victorine Muybridge. So, and here the way she's represented is almost as challenging, almost as difficult as her actual subject that he chose. Rather than having the submissive reclining pose that we would expect to see looking at Titian's Venus, of this modest and married woman who's looking at us with a sensuality that is clearly submissive and clearly marital, this woman looks at us with a challenging gaze. She almost seems to say, "Next customer, please." She's engaging us from above as well. You'll notice the perspective is different. And in the image here, we can see the earlier work by Titian. And you'll notice that she appears to be kind of glancing upward at us. We're in a position of power. But Victorine Muybridge here in Olympia, it's very different. She's gazing kind of downward at us, casting her eyes down. And it appears to be quite clear that she is the one who is in control here. It's this sense of dangerous sexuality. Also, some other subtle things here are included. When we look at the Titian, we can see the little dog representing fidelity at the foot of the bed, whereas in Manet's version we have a cat, which is certainly not intended to convey the same message. And there's also a little bit, unfortunately, kind of a racist statement here by Manet as well. Whereas in the work by Titian, we have these two young bridesmaids, or maids rather, in the back who are gathering clothes and getting ready to dress this young woman. Instead, we have this African-American or black woman in the foreground, and she is clearly intended to represent kind of a more primal sexuality. And this is something that, again, is rather racist in terms of today's standards and understandings, but was intended to lend to this air of dangerous sexuality and sensuality at the time. So while realism as an art movement really focuses in Paris, and we really can talk about two guys and be pretty much done with it, to be honest, if we talk about Courbet and Manet, there are other artists we also associate with this, and some of these really do have some significant things to bring to the party, so to speak. One of these is the American Winslow Homer, and this is a powerful image painted in 1865. And at first this may look fairly basic. You've got an image of a man standing in a field with a scythe harvesting grain. There's a lot more to this, and the title actually really kind of helps to clue us in to exactly what's going on here. You'll notice the title of The Veteran in a New Field certainly refers to the Civil War. But there's a little more going on. If we look carefully, we can see on the right-hand side some of his discarded kit. We can see the canteen and other materials that he would have carried into battle. And then the other thing is the scythe itself that he's using to harvest the grain. Now, there's no way we would know this today without a little reference, but what he's using is not a piece of modern technology. The scythe that he's using is incredibly outdated. At this period in time, they would have been using a much more modern piece of equipment to harvest like this. And so it's really symbolic using a scythe. And if we think about it, what does the scythe really represent? What other characters might we see that are represented by the scythe? And of course, the Grim Reaper comes to mind. And so what he's doing clearly here is he's harvesting or reaping. And if we look at the title again, The Veteran in a New Field, we have to ask ourselves the question, if this is the new field, what was the old field? And the answer, of course, is that the veteran is now harvesting grain, harvesting wheat, whereas in the past, in his old field, he was harvesting lives. So this image here by Eadweard Muybridge has a great story behind it. Muybridge was an early pioneer of photography and is credited really with being the first guy to kind of develop a movie camera, if you will. He called it the Zoopraxiscope. And a lot of this comes actually from trying to settle a bet. There was the governor of California at the time was Leland Stanford, and he had a bet about whether or not a horse ever had all 4 feet off the ground when it was running. And so he hired Muybridge to come and run a set of photographs in order to determine whether or not it was true. And so he set up a series of cameras that would all go off at set intervals while the horse galloped by. And this became really the beginnings of the movie camera. You put these images together, of course, and what you end up having is is rather than a simple still image, you end up with, a primitive camera, a primitive movie camera, rather. So it turns out that in truth, the horse's legs were off the ground. You can see that clearly if you look at the second frame. And he was so successful with this that he ended up creating a book called Human and Animal Locomotion. And his photographs, by the way, had a significant impact on later artists, such as Degas, Duchamp, and others. He was really quite successful as a result. So one last artist that we'll look at and discuss is kind of loosely associated with the realist movement. It's not really the best description of this guy. His name is John Singer Sargent. He's actually born in America, but is best known for the work that he did in Europe, primarily in England. But Sargent, he didn't really fit in terms of the content and even the style to some extent with some of the other realist painters. He was a society portrait painter, but an incredibly successful one. And his work even today is incredibly powerful and beautiful. Sargent is best known for, again, painting images of these kind of beautiful society people. And one of the paintings that he's probably best known for is the image we're looking at here, the Scandalous Madam X. And this painting actually almost ruined his career, which is kind of interesting. He met this woman. Her name was Madame Bouguereau. Met her in 1881, and she was a famous Paris socialite. She was a beautiful woman, very well known in society, very popular, and he actually ended up, Sargent wrote to a friend of his who knew her, and to see if there was some way that she'd be willing to sit for a portrait. And so it worked out and ended up happening. But turned out that she wasn't a very good subject. She was lazy. She didn't want to sit and pose for any period of time. And she was so pale. She had such pale, light-colored skin that it was very difficult to paint her without her looking like a corpse. But he manages to complete the painting, and really because of what he does and because of the way he handles the painting, he kind of gets himself into trouble. First off, he does it very large. It's over 7 feet tall. And that's kind of a big statement. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is because he represents her in such an evocative, such a sensual way, it's almost kind of, at the time, at the period in history, almost considered to be borderline pornographic. And by today's standards, of course, it might not be considered to be the most modest painting in the world, but we don't see it as being scandalous. However, one of the things we need to know is that there's a minor change to the painting that we can't see. So let's take a look at this next image here, and we'll see what I'm talking about. So on the left-hand side, there's a black and white photograph of the original painting. And so you can see that it has been slightly, ever so slightly modified. And if you look, you can see that the dress just looks a little bit funny in the color version. That's because it looks like it's kind of coming off of one side a little bit there, but the strap's in the right place, which doesn't make any sense. But if you look at the original way in which this painting was created, you can see the strap is actually slipping off of her shoulder. So she is just about to pop out of this dress. And the work was damned by the critics before the doors to the show even opened. There was a huge scandal. And because she was so sensual and so large scale and really kind of threatening in terms of her presence, the family of this woman was absolutely furious. And their intent was to destroy the work as soon as the salon was over. But Sargent actually ended up fleeing. He left Paris with the painting and just got out of Dodge. And the painting actually ended up in the United States and is now part of a collection here.